Hi there, I'm Jeff of Jeff Werthmann-Radnich Coaching, and each week I talk about a different subject related to small business ownership burnout. And this week I wanted to talk about stress as a teacher, because oftentimes when we're a small business owner, we experience quite a bit of stress. There's always something going on, some issue that we're dealing with, or problem that comes up. And being a small business owner typically means wearing all the hats too. So whatever the problem is, whether it's related to you know human resources or the finances, we're the go-to. And so with that, there's a lot of things going on, a lot of stresses that come out throughout our day. And oftentimes, we, you know, like, most people, we want to avoid that stress. We're just like, I don't want to deal with this right now. I don't want to have to deal with this issue. And sometimes there's no way around it, so, we'll do it, and we'll just suffer the uncomfortability, and then there are other times where, we're like, well, I can put this off till tomorrow, and then we put it off till the day after and the day after. And, what are we doing there? Well, you know, in a sense, we're, helping ourselves to feel comfortable, and to, not have to deal with the uncomfortability that comes with those stressful situations. But another way to look at it is just how are we relating to our stress? What is it that we're hearing when we're in that stressful space, or when we feel under pressure. And typically it's this feeling of I don't like this. This stress is my enemy. I want it as far away from myself as possible. So, we either barrel through whatever the situation is, or again, put it off, or, hoping that, as time passes, it'll go away, which sometimes is the case, but, oftentimes it'll just linger there, waiting for us, which creates even more stress because, we've got this thing in the back of our mind that, I got to deal with this sometime. I don't want to deal with it now, but, it's taking up that mental and emotional real estate while it's just sitting there waiting to be dealt with. So, you know, one way of looking at it is, that stress is the enemy. Another way, is that it's a teacher, and oftentimes, stress is there, to teach us a lesson, to help us to be aware of what is it that we're uncomfortable about. Why is this an uncomfortable situation? And if we allow ourselves a moment to get curious and to take a deep breath and step back from, that stressful feeling, and look at it objectively for, even just a moment can be enough to be able to say, why am I feeling this way? Why is this a stressful situation? And, how can I best approach this situation? A lot of times, these things that, we think are stressful is because we're relating it back to a similar situation, where things went bad, or where things became difficult for us. So we assume that it's going to be the same this time. And, the reality is that each situation is unique. There are times where, I've had conversations with employees where, it didn't work out well, and that was typically, during the times when, I was first starting my business, first learning, well, what do I do in this situation? And we often forget that in our dealings with these stressful situations in the past, we've learned and we've grown, whether we realize it or not. We're not handling them the same way that we used to, but we're still thinking about it in the sense of, you know, that's who I am, that's what happened in that situation, and that's what's going to happen here. So, part of what we can do to help ourselves with these situations is just to, allow ourselves the space to look at it objectively and look at it as a lesson. What can I learn from this situation? What can help me move forward? What are things going to look like, once the situation is resolved? And part of it is just our attitude toward it. If we're looking at it as, this is a big scary monster, of course that's what's going to show. If we can flip that to where we're looking at it as, wow, I'm going to come out of this situation, knowing more, feeling more confident, I'm going to learn from this. We help ourselves to relate to that situation, to dig in and go, okay, this needs to get done. Let's do it. Let's find out what happens. Let's be curious about it. And, so I mean, that's one of the ways that we can help ourselves, to move forward, out of these stressful situations and to relate to stress as a teacher. But, there are other ways in which we can help ourselves, and, probably the most important is just, not only just being kind to ourselves, but, treating ourselves well, doing what it is that we need to do on a day-to-day basis to, help ourselves feel better, feel more energetic. When we're in that burnt out space, when we've been dealing with a lot of stress, for a long time, it naturally wears us down. And so any situation, no matter how small, can feel big or can feel stressful when, if we get enough rest, if we allow ourselves to take a break from our work, and, to help ourselves to, enjoy life in general, and take that care of ourselves to where when those situations arrive, we just have more energy in which to engage them with. When we're constantly, just, knocking ourselves down, we don't have the energy to engage with those problems the way we might, if we were giving ourselves the time and space to take care of ourselves. So, I mean, that's something else to keep in mind. But, back to the point of, stress as a teacher, next time you're in a situation where, you're like, I don't want to deal with this, take a deep breath, look at it for what it is, and then decide on how you want to approach it. And to remember that every situation is unique and that you've handled situations like this before, you can handle them now. Everything is going to be fine. And, of course, that's difficult to do in the moment, which is why it helps to step back, allow ourselves, even a quick second just to be, regulate ourselves and, to acknowledge the emotional state that we're in, but also to give ourselves that moment to be like, okay, ask ourselves, how do we want to feel? I want to feel confident going into this. I want to feel, comfortable in myself, and I've done this before, I can do it again. It's that belief in ourselves that, helps us through those stressful situations. And, we have more knowledge and more capability than we often believe ourselves to have. So I hope this has been helpful. If this is a situation that repeatedly comes up for you, though, where, you're in repeatedly encountering these stressful situations and you're just not sure what to do or how to handle it or how to get out of this space of burnout, feel free to contact me. You can leave a note here. You can email me at jeff@jwrcoaching.com. I would love to open up a conversation, see how I might be able to help. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will catch you again next Wednesday. Take care.